consolidation of Achaemenid hegemony following the fall of Babylon reconfigured the geopolitical architecture of the Levant, integrating Yehud as a subordinate administrative unit within an empire stretching from India to Egypt. Imperial policy under Cyrus and Darius extended beyond territorial control. Decrees explicitly authorized religious patronage that facilitated the reconstruction of cultic infrastructure in Jerusalem, establishing a direct link between state resources and local worship restoration. This political stabilization Archaeological corpora recovered from the Elephantine Island colony provide tangible documentation of Yahwistic praxis operating within Achaemenid provincial structures. These Aramaic papyri reveal a community that maintained temple rituals and sacrificial cycles while navigating imperial legal requirements, demonstrating how subordinate religious groups negotiated autonomy through adherence to bureaucratic protocols. Comparative analysis suggests that such diaspora settlements served as testing grounds for ritual uniformity, where the necessity of communicating with satrapal authorities incentivized the adoption of standardized liturgical formulas and centralized administrative oversight. The gradual suppression of local shrine worship in favor of a single Jerusalemite sanctuary mirrors broader imperial policies promoting unified cultic centers to facilitate tax collection and political stability, indicating that theological centralization may have functioned as a byproduct of geopolitical consolidation. Numismatic surveys of Judean settlements reveal a distinct stratigraphic shift coinciding with Achaemenid expansion, characterized by the emergence of standardized imperial currency within domestic and cultic contexts. Excavations at sites including Jerusalem and Lachish have recovered darics and siglos dating to the mid-Persian period, indicating direct economic integration rather than mere peripheral trade exposure. Concurrently, metrological analyses confirm the adoption of official Persian weight standards for silver shekels across Yehud, aligning local fiscal practices with imperial norms required for tax assessment and tribute processing. These material indices suggest that while theological distinctiveness was preserved, the operational economy supporting temple reconstruction and community sustenance functioned within a monetized framework established by regional administration. The ubiquity of these standardized exchange mechanisms underscores how Achaemenid economic policy provided the structural substrate enabling localized religious institutions to access broader resource networks without necessitating doctrinal assimilation. Achaemenid administrative apparatus relied upon Imperial Aramaic as a standardized medium for interprovincial communication and legal documentation, creating a pervasive scribal environment that permeated provincial centers including Yehud. Epigraphic records from Judean contexts demonstrate the functional deployment of this linguistic infrastructure alongside distinct Hebrew liturgical registers, indicating a bilingual operational reality within religious administration. Textual criticism reveals significant Aramaic influence in post-exilic biblical literature, particularly through the incorporation of administrative terminology and formulaic structures derived from imperial correspondence protocols. The presence of these bureaucratic conventions suggests that scribal circles responsible for redacting Yahwistic traditions were trained within or heavily influenced by Persian educational systems, facilitating the codification of religious law using organizational frameworks imported from the center while preserving distinct theological content. Archival evidence recovered from a military colony on Elephantine Island in Upper Egypt provides critical material for assessing Yahwistic practice outside Judean borders during the Achaemenid era. These Aramaic papyri, dating primarily to the late 5th century BCE, document a garrison community that maintained its own sanctuary and distinct priestly lineages independent of Jerusalem's centralizing authority. The corpus includes legal petitions appealing directly to Persian satrapal officials regarding temple reconstruction following local destruction, demonstrating how provincial groups utilized imperial bureaucratic channels to secure religious infrastructure. Furthermore, the Passover papyrus records festival observances that diverge from Deuteronomic prescriptions later codified in biblical redactions, indicating liturgical pluralism was accommodated across imperial territories. This epistolary record underscores that Achaemenid administrative structures facilitated not only political stability but also the preservation of diverse Yahwistic traditions through standardized legal mechanisms accessible to peripheral communities. Shul analysis indicates that Judean scribal practices underwent significant formalization during this period, evidenced by the rapid adoption of the square Aramaic alphabet in administrative and liturgical contexts, following earlier resistance documented at sites like Wadi Dalieh and Samaria. This orthographic shift aligns with broader Achaemenid efforts to standardize written communication across satrapies, facilitating more efficient transmission of legal and ritual directives between provincial centers and imperial authorities. Comparative studies of formulaic language reveal that certain priestly compositions incorporate syntactic structures characteristic of imperial Aramaic chancery documents, suggesting that Judean scribes may have received training within or adjacent to administrative networks operating under Persian oversight. Such convergence implies that the consolidation of liturgical texts was not merely an internal theological development, but a process mediated by the structural requirements and communicative tools inherent in imperial governance frameworks. Beyond the standardization of script and administrative protocol, the Achaemenid milieu catalyzed profound theological restructuring within developing Yahwistic tradition. Comparative religious studies highlight a striking temporal correlation between Judean exposure to Iranian cosmological frameworks and the emergence of eschatological concepts in late Persian period literature, including doctrines concerning resurrection, final judgment, and systematized angelology evident in texts such as Daniel and 2nd Isaiah. While scholars caution against simplistic models of direct borrowing given the complexity of Near Eastern religious exchange, the convergence of these theological innovations during centuries of Judean integration into imperial networks suggests that Achaemenid ideological paradigms may have provided new conceptual vocabularies for articulating YHWH's universal sovereignty and cosmic order beyond earlier nationalistic boundaries. The Aramaic administrative correspondence recovered at Elephantine documents a critical juncture where provincial religious autonomy clashed with centralization mandates initiated by scribes operating within Jerusalem. These texts reveal disputes concerning the legitimacy of local sanctuaries and the permissibility of offering sacrifices to deities other than Yahweh, highlighting how imperial-era scribal circles promoted strict monotheistic boundaries that diverged from established diaspora practices. The intervention figures in these letters advocate for ritual centralization consistent with Deuteronomic legislation, illustrating how theological arguments regarding exclusive worship were deployed to resolve jurisdictional conflicts between distant communities and the Jerusalem establishment. Analysis of administrative correspondence from the Jewish garrison at Elephantine reveals how Achaemenid bureaucratic frameworks structured diaspora religious negotiation during the mid-5th century BCE. Petitions preserved in Aramaic papyri demonstrate that community leaders employed standardized imperial legal formulas and procedural rhetoric when soliciting satrapal approval for sanctuary reconstruction projects following local destruction events. This epistolary evidence indicates that Persian provincial governance established a normative administrative lexicon which Yahwistic institutions necessarily adopted to legitimize their ritual operations within the broader empire, thereby embedding state-sanctioned diplomatic conventions into internal communal decision-making processes. Archaeological investigations within Jerusalem's Persian-era strata yield significant clusters of seal impressions that illuminate the intersection of local religious authority and imperial bureaucracy. These bulli, recovered from domestic quarters adjacent to sanctuary precincts, bear inscriptions identifying owners by name and often associating them with administrative functions or elite status. The concentration of such artifacts implies that individuals managing ritual affairs frequently operated within the same bureaucratic networks as provincial officials, utilizing standardized signet conventions recognized across the satrapy system. This material record underscores a structural convergence wherein Judean religious institutions were not isolated enclaves but integrated nodes functioning through shared protocols of identification and accountability inherent to Achaemenid governance. Ideological parallels between Achaemenid royal inscriptions asserting universal sovereignty under divine sanction and expanded theological claims regarding Yahweh's dominion over all nations appear prominently in post-exilic prophetic literature. Research by Amélie Court highlights how imperial propaganda consistently framed the great king as the appointed steward of global order, a conceptual framework that resonates with emerging biblical motifs emphasizing universal jurisdiction rather than strictly localized tribal patronage. This convergence suggests an environment where theological articulation engaged directly with prevailing political discourses concerning legitimate authority and cosmic hierarchy. Analyzing these ideological intersections requires careful differentiation between independent prophetic development reflecting genuine geopolitical shifts versus adaptive rhetoric designed to position Yahwistic worship within the broader cosmological narrative endorsed by imperial administration. Comparative ideological frameworks analyzed by Peter Machinist at Harvard University examine how Achaemenid royal inscriptions articulate a cosmology where imperial authority upholds universal order, creating an intellectual milieu that may have stimulated theological expansion among subject populations. Examination of 2nd Isaiah's prophetic declarations reveals conceptual parallels with Persian court rhetoric concerning the elevation of a supreme deity over all nations and monarchs, although biblical redactors systematically invert this hierarchy to subordinate royal power exclusively to Yahwistic sovereignty. If these universalist themes develop through dialectical engagement with imperial ideology rather than internal isolation, then post-exilic scriptural evolution could reflect strategic appropriation of dominant political discourse to reassert distinct religious identity within the empire's ideological boundaries. Archival discoveries at Elephantine provide critical empirical data regarding the operational integration of Yahwistic communities within Achaemenid administrative structures. Upaprai from this Egyptian frontier settlement document a local sanctuary dedicated to Yahweh whose maintenance required formal petitions utilizing standardized imperial legal formulas. Epigraphic analysis indicates these documents employ Aramaic chancery language identical to Persian provincial correspondence, suggesting religious administration adopted the empire's bureaucratic syntax for legitimizing ritual infrastructure. Comparative studies of biblical corpora containing memorials or decrees reveal structural parallels with Achaemenid edicts concerning resource allocation and tax exemptions for sanctuary upkeep. If post-exilic communities utilized imperial legal frameworks to secure privileges for worship practices, then the institutional morphology of early Yahwism likely evolved through direct engagement with Persian administrative protocols rather than independent development. Examination of vessel registries embedded within Second Temple period literature reveals structural formatting aligned with Achaemenid administrative conventions. Comparative analysis of sacred object inventories found in Ezra and Haggai demonstrates numerical precision and material categorization techniques mirroring bureaucratic documentation standards utilized across Persian provincial networks. This convergence implies that liturgical equipment was increasingly conceptualized through imperial fiscal frameworks, positioning temple assets as auditable resources requiring formal enumeration alongside theological significance. The adoption of such inventory mechanics suggests post-exilic religious institutions may have internal administrative vocabularies to validate restoration petitions before satrapal authorities, thereby embedding bureaucratic methodology directly into the textual architecture of worship. Comparative studies of Aramaic administrative corpora reveal significant convergence between standard Achaemenid chancery formulas and emerging liturgical structures within post-exilic Judean texts. Analysis of legal syntax in documents from Elephantine demonstrates how Jewish scribes adopted imperial documentary conventions, including standardized phrasing for oaths, property transactions, and communal obligations, which subsequently permeated codified religious regulations. This textual assimilation suggests that the bureaucratic infrastructure required to manage diverse provincial populations also supplied a functional lexicon for articulating covenantal duties within Yahwistic communities. When administrative templates become embedded in scriptural formulation, they effectively normalize imperial modes of organization as inherent components of sacred identity. Evidence from provincial records demonstrates that Achaemenid governance mechanisms prioritized the synchronization of cultic calendars to streamline fiscal coordination across satrapies. This systemic pressure necessitated restructuring Judean temporal frameworks, transitioning from fluid agricultural markers toward rigid liturgical schedules preserved in post-exilic Torah strata. The establishment of the 7-day week as a continuous cycle divorced from lunar variability mirrors imperial timekeeping standards implemented for uniform provincial regulation. Accordingly, ritual directives concerning Sabbaths and pilgrimage festivals within later priestly texts exhibit structural conformity with Achaemenid expectations regarding predictable worship cycles, integrating indigenous temporal practices into standardized systems aligned with wider Near Eastern administrative protocols. Comparative examination of post-exilic purity codes reveals a marked intensification in Yahwistic emphasis upon ritual separation and dietary demarcation, developments that align structurally with broader Achaemenid frameworks prioritizing behavioral regulation to sustain cosmic equilibrium. Analysis of Zoroastrian liturgical corpora demonstrates analogous mechanisms wherein adherence to precise boundary protocols functions as the primary defense against disordering forces rather than solely through sacrificial mediation. This convergence suggests how satrapal administrative imperatives regarding communal hygiene and resource standardization may have reinforced emerging Judean theological shifts that increasingly equated ritual distinctiveness with covenant fidelity, thereby reorienting worship practices from transactional atonement towards sustained maintenance of sacred profane boundaries within the imperial context. Comparative analysis of prophetic visions and Achaemenid administrative records highlights structural parallels in organizational hierarchy rather than mere lexical borrowing. Textual depictions of Yahweh's counsel increasingly feature specialized functionaries, scribes, watchers, and messengers that correspond to documented roles within Persian imperial governance structures during the 5th century BCE. Epigraphic evidence from Western Asia Minor demonstrates how court protocol emphasized meticulous record-keeping and delegated authority through subordinate officials, concepts that appear reflected in evolving descriptions of heavenly administration where divine oversight operates through appointed celestial agents rather than direct intervention alone. This bureaucratic reframing suggests exposure to sophisticated state management systems provided a tangible template for conceptualizing cosmic order as an organized apparatus requiring systematic maintenance and reporting mechanisms. Linguistic examination of the Ezra-Nehemiah corpus reveals extensive utilization of Imperial Aramaic Chancery terminology that extends beyond functional translation into the adoption of standardized diplomatic formulas characteristic of Achaemenid governance. Comparative epigraphy demonstrates remarkable congruence between petitionary structures found in these biblical passages and administrative documents recovered from Elephantine, as well as legal tablets originating at Persepolis, particularly regarding requests for temple reconstruction and community autonomy. The presence of specific formulaic phrases used to address royal authority indicates that Judean scribes engaged directly with imperial discourse mechanisms rather than merely observing them from a distance. This textual integration implies a strategic appropriation of Persian administrative vocabulary to articulate theological claims within the framework recognized by the empire, thereby positioning Yahwistic worship as compatible with and protected under established protocols for provincial religious maintenance. The convergence of scriptural narrative with official bureaucratic language underscores how community identity in this period was increasingly negotiated through legally defined boundaries that drew legitimacy from both divine revelation and imperial sanction. Textual examination of Aramaic Mamanda preserved within Ezra-Nehemiah reveals systematic integration of Persian imperial correspondence protocols directly into biblical composition strategies. These embedded documents employ standardized chancery language addressing temple reconstruction mandates, fiscal privileges for priestly orders, and resource allocation mechanisms consistent with verified Achaemenid governance records recovered from sites such as Elephantine and Persepolis. The deliberate insertion of official administrative registers alongside narrative material suggests scribal authors utilized familiar bureaucratic formats to authenticate religious authority claims within a pluralistic imperial context. Such compositional techniques highlight how mastery of state documentation practices enabled Judean elites to navigate political requirements while simultaneously establishing enduring textual boundaries for communal identity formation. Analysis of administrative correspondence recovered from Elephantine reveals practical negotiations between Judean communities and provincial governors regarding sanctuary reconstruction, demonstrating how religious authority was frequently contingent upon securing imperial bureaucratic approval rather than theological alignment with court religion. Examination of seal impressions bearing both Aramaic inscriptions and distinctively Yudistic motifs at excavation sites indicates functional integration within the imperial postal system while maintaining localized cultic identity through material culture markers. These findings suggest that early post-exilic worship developments may have been shaped by pragmatic adaptation to administrative requirements, where liturgical stability depended on navigating provincial governance structures rather than responding to centralized doctrinal mandates or isolated theological innovation. Scholarly scrutiny of the so-called Persian royal charters embedded within Ezra-Nehemiah raises critical questions regarding the distinction between documentary translation and literary construction. Researchers such as Peter Fry have demonstrated that these texts appear exclusively in passages advocating for Judean restoration projects, absent from narratives where imperial policy might contradict local interests. This distribution pattern suggests a possible rhetorical strategy wherein scribes employed established formulas of Achaemenid administrative discourse to legitimize temple reconstruction and communal boundaries within the scriptural tradition itself. Consequently, evaluating genuine cultural transmission requires distinguishing between verifiable bureaucratic interactions documented in provincial archives and potential narrative appropriations of imperial authority designed to reinforce internal theological agendas during a period of identity consolidation. Epigraphic corpora excavated from provincial administrative centers offer concrete documentation regarding the operational dynamics of Yahwistic settlements under Achaemenid sovereignty. The Elephantine Papyri archive reveals a diasporic community maintaining an active sanctuary dedicated to Yahweh functioning within Egyptian territory without interference from satrapal officials who generally tolerated local cults provided tax obligations were met and civic order preserved. Internal correspondence contained within these documents demonstrates leaders utilizing Persian legal frameworks to resolve property disputes while simultaneously engaging in trans-regional communication with Jerusalemite authorities concerning ritual compliance and priestly appointments. This evidentiary record indicates that imperial infrastructure facilitated sustained contact between dispersed groups without mandating theological uniformity, allowing regional liturgical practices to coexist alongside centralizing scribal initiatives for extended periods before normative consolidation occurred through internal religious negotiation rather than external political coercion. The Achaemenid administrative apparatus relied extensively upon Imperial Aramaic as the standardized language of communication across diverse provincial territories, establishing a bureaucratic infrastructure that necessitated direct engagement between Judean scribes and imperial authorities during the post-exilic period. Examination of the Aramaic passages preserved within Ezra-Nehemiah demonstrates formulae and structural conventions characteristic of official chancellery correspondence rather than indigenous literary composition, indicating that religious leadership navigated established administrative protocols to secure resources for temple restoration. This textual evidence suggests a deliberate adaptation where Judean elites integrated imperial documentation standards into their own theological discourse, utilizing recognized bureaucratic forms to articulate community organization and legitimize worship practices within the broader framework of Persian provincial governance. Achaemenid royal inscriptions and monumental art consistently articulate a state ideology predicated upon the restoration of cosmic order through the reconstruction of sanctuaries dedicated to local deities, framing temple building as an expression of imperial piety rather than mere administrative concession. This political theology provided a structural template that Judean religious authorities appear to have synthesized with indigenous prophetic traditions, reconfiguring concepts of divine election and exile within a framework where Persian hegemony was acknowledged yet subordinated to Yahwistic sovereignty. Comparative textual analysis reveals how post-exilic priestly writings integrate themes of universal kingship and sanctuary permanence that resonate with broader Near Eastern patterns of religious rehabilitation under centralized empires, indicating that theological developments during this period were actively shaped by engagement with Achaemenid ideological currents while maintaining distinct covenantal boundaries. Extending beyond material parallels, Achaemenid administrative protocols established a structural ecosystem that facilitated the consolidation of Yahwistic practice. Persian imperial policy routinely authorized funding for regional temple restoration as a mechanism to secure provincial loyalty, a documented strategy evident in Babylonian archives and reflected in biblical records detailing Darius I's support for Jerusalem's reconstruction efforts. This institutional patronage empowered priestly authorities to centralize cultic activity at the Judean capital while diminishing alternative shrines, thereby accelerating textual harmonization projects that aligned local liturgy with broader imperial standards of order and legitimacy.